Most people think Indonesia is just another developing country in Southeast Asia. But what if I told you that the world needs Indonesia far more than Indonesia needs the world? Because hidden behind those tropical beaches and crowded cities is a country that quietly controls global trade routes, critical minerals, and a market so massive superpowers line up just to stay in its good books. And here's the irony. While Indonesia struggles with corruption, rising costs, and infrastructure gaps, the world's biggest economies are now strategically dependent on Indonesia for their ships, their factories, their energy, and even their food supplies. In this video, we'll explore how Indonesia's geography gives it a power that neither China nor the US can bypass, why global industries from EVs to electronics collapse without Indonesia's resources, and how Indonesia's don't panic sides diplomacy forces superpowers to compete for its attention. But the real twist comes at the end. Because Indonesia is quietly building something that could shift global power for decades, and almost no one outside Asia sees it coming. Let's begin. Imagine looking at a world map, but instead of borders, you only see the arteries of global trade. Thin blue lines stretching across oceans, carrying oil, grain, electronics, machinery, everything that keeps modern life alive. Now zoom into Southeast Asia and you'll notice something remarkable. Those lines don't go around Indonesia, they go through it. Indonesia sits on top of the world's most important choke point cluster, the Malacca Strait, the Sunda Strait, and the Lombok Strait. These aren't just bits of water, they are the traffic lights of global trade, and Indonesia is the country standing next to the switch. Let's start with the Malacca Strait. Narrow, shallow, and congested, but absolutely unavoidable. More than 40% of global maritime trade passes through this single lane between Malaysia, Singapore, and Indonesia. If Malacca slows down, the world's supply chains start sweating. But here's what most people don't realize. If Malacca gets blocked, the only meaningful alternatives are Indonesian waters. Ships must reroute through the Sunda Strait or the Lombok Strait, both fully inside Indonesia's sphere of influence. That means no matter what happens, global trade remains tied to Indonesia's geography like a lifeline. From the oil tankers leaving the Middle East, to China's factories hungry for resources, to Japan and South Korea which import 90% of their energy, every supply chain from Asia to Europe depends on Indonesia's permission, stability, and cooperation. Even the United States, with all its military power, cannot force global trade to bypass Indonesia. Its navy patrols the Indo-Pacific, but Indonesia controls the actual water gates. And this is where Indonesia's quiet leverage comes in. Unlike countries that shout their power, Indonesia doesn't need to. Geography does the talking. The world can negotiate trade deals, build alliances, even threaten sanctions. But none of that changes the simple fact that ships must pass through Indonesian-controlled routes. Choke these waters and economies collapse. Keep them open and the world keeps running. This unique position, accidental, natural, but extremely strategic, is why countries need Indonesia far more than Indonesia needs them. And it's just the beginning of Indonesia's hidden influence. If Indonesia's geography gives it power over the world's trade routes, its natural resources give it power over the world's future. Because hidden beneath its tropical soil is an arsenal of minerals and commodities that modern economies simply cannot survive without. Let's start with the big one, nickel. The metal that powers electric vehicle batteries, energy storage systems, and the global shift toward clean energy. Indonesia isn't just a major player, it owns the game. With the largest nickel reserves on Earth, Indonesia has become the country Tesla, BID, Volkswagen, and almost every EV manufacturer depends on. And Indonesia knows it. In 2020, when Jakarta banned raw nickel exports to force foreign companies to build factories inside Indonesia, global nickel prices spiked almost instantly. Countries panicked, supply chains scrambled, and Indonesia proved a point. If it tightens the tap, the EV revolution slows down. But nickel is only one piece of the puzzle. Indonesia is also one of the world's biggest coal exporters, and despite the global talk about green energy, South Asia, China, and Southeast Asia still rely heavily on coal to keep their lights on. When India faces energy shortages, it turns to Indonesia. When China's power grid is under pressure, it buys Indonesian coal by the shipload. Millions of homes across the region are illuminated because Indonesian coal keeps their grids alive. Then there is palm oil, the most used edible oil on the planet, found in everything from chocolate and shampoo to medicines and cosmetics. Nearly half of all supermarket products contain palm oil, and Indonesia is the world's top producer. If Indonesia slows production, global food and consumer goods manufacturers immediately feel the shockwave. Add to this Indonesia's massive reserves of copper, tin, and gold, all essential for electronics, wiring, semiconductors, and industrial machinery. Your phone, your laptop, your appliances, even the wiring inside your home, there's a good chance Indonesia played a role in making them possible. All these resources give Indonesia something extremely rare, unavoidable importance. Countries can diversify trade partners, shift alliances, or build new routes, but they cannot replace what Indonesia provides. And as the world transitions to electric vehicles and renewable technologies, Indonesia's strategic value will only grow. This is why superpowers compete for Indonesia's attention, because without its resources, entire industries would struggle to survive. When people talk about Indonesia, they often focus on its islands, its culture, or its resources. But the real engine of Indonesia's power isn't underground, it's its people. With 275 million citizens, Indonesia is the fourth largest population in the world. That alone makes it impossible for global companies and governments to ignore. But what truly matters is what's happening inside that population. A fast rising middle class that's growing quicker than in most Western countries. Every year, millions of Indonesians move from lower income to middle income, and when that happens, buying habits change. People buy more smartphones, more motorcycles, more cars, more appliances, more branded products. And this is exactly why multinational giants are pouring billions into the country. Look at Samsung, Toyota, Honda, Unilever, Nestle, Apple. These companies don't just operate in Indonesia, they depend on Indonesia. For many of them, Indonesia is one of the rare markets where demand is still increasing, not shrinking. While Europe and Japan face aging populations, Indonesia is young, energetic, and rapidly urbanizing. If a company wants long-term growth, it must capture the Indonesian consumer. And then there is the digital economy, the crown jewel of Southeast Asia. Indonesia's online market is already the largest in the region, bigger than Singapore, Thailand, Malaysia, and Vietnam combined. Platforms like GoTo, Tokopedia, Shopee, Grab, and Bukalapak aren't just apps. They're ecosystems serving tens of millions of daily users. Startups test their products in Indonesia first because the scale is unmatched. Investors know that if a tech company wins Indonesia, it wins Southeast Asia. This massive market also gives Indonesia leverage in diplomacy and trade. Countries want Indonesia not just as a supplier of resources, but as a buyer, a huge population that can absorb products, invest in foreign brands, and fuel corporate profits. That's why Japan invests heavily in Indonesian infrastructure, why South Korea builds factories in Jakarta, why China, the US, and the EU all compete for Indonesian partnerships. They're not just chasing cooperation, they're chasing customers. In a world where many economies are slowing down, Indonesia is one of the few places where growth still looks promising. And for multinational corporations and foreign governments, not being in Indonesia means losing out one of the largest and fastest growing markets on the planet. This isn't just a country anymore, it's a billion-dollar battleground and everyone wants a piece of it. In a world increasingly divided between great power blocks, Indonesia stands out for one simple reason. It refuses to choose sides. And that refusal is exactly what gives it power. Unlike many countries pressured into aligning with either the United States or China, Indonesia follows a foreign policy doctrine known as independent and active, a principle rooted in the nation's identity since the Cold War. It means Jakarta doesn't simply react to global politics, it actively shapes them while staying neutral. This neutrality isn't weakness, it's strategic strength. Indonesia doesn't fully embrace China, yet it doesn't distance itself either. Beijing invests billions in Indonesian infrastructure from high-speed rail to industrial parks. But at the same time, Indonesia pushes back against China's claims in the South China Sea and rejects any dependency that threatens its sovereignty. And then there is the United States. Washington sees Indonesia as a crucial partner in balancing China's rise, but Indonesia refuses to be a pawn. It cooperates on security, trade, investment, but stops short of joining US-led alliances that could compromise its independence. This balancing act is not accidental. It's a deliberate diplomatic strategy, and it works because Indonesia is the largest democracy in ASEAN, giving it moral and political weight in regional decisions. When Indonesia takes a position, ASEAN listens. Its voice gives legitimacy to regional agreements, maritime codes of conduct, and negotiations with global powers. This neutrality also puts Indonesia in a unique position. Everyone wants it on their side. China courts Indonesia through the Belt and Road Initiative. The US includes Indonesia in the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. Japan invests heavily in Indonesian ports, railways, and factories. The EU negotiates access to Indonesia's booming market and resources. And the Middle East, especially the UAE and Saudi Arabia, pours billions into Indonesian startups, infrastructure, and energy projects. Indonesia doesn't chase alliances. Alliances chase Indonesia. And this gives Jakarta the rare ability to extract benefits from all sides: investments from China, security cooperation from the US, technology from Japan, markets from the EU, and capital from the Middle East. Few countries have this kind of diplomatic flexibility. In a region where tensions are rising, Indonesia has quietly become the balancing point of Asia, the country that everyone needs, yet no one can fully control. If Indonesia's past was shaped by geography and resources, its future will be defined by something far more powerful: global dependency. Because as the world enters a new era of economic, technological, and environmental challenges, Indonesia isn't just keeping up, it's becoming the country other nations must rely on to survive. It all started with Jakarta's bold decision to ban raw nickel exports, what looked like a risky move turned into a masterstroke. Instead of shipping out raw minerals, Indonesia forced companies to come inside Indonesia and build processing plants, refineries, and factories. China did it. South Korea did it. Even Western companies had to follow. This policy didn't just create jobs, it created dependence. Foreign industries now rely on Indonesia's soil and Indonesia's industrial ecosystem. Once a country builds billion-dollar facilities on your land, you gain leverage. They can't leave easily and they can't afford to upset you. Then there's Nusantara, the new capital rising from the forests of Borneo. It's more than a relocation project. It's a statement that Indonesia is preparing for the next century. The moment construction began, billions of dollars in foreign investment started flowing in. Japan, South Korea, the UAE, and even European investors are competing to build pieces of this futuristic city. Highways, ports, factories, green energy projects. Nusantara is becoming a magnet for global capital. And this matters because the world is entering the energy transition era. Electric vehicles, solar panels, renewable storage. All of them require materials that Indonesia dominates: nickel, copper, bauxite, and rare minerals. Without Indonesia, EV supply chains shrink, battery production slows, renewable infrastructure becomes more expensive. In other words, the world's green future depends on Indonesia's brown minerals. But there is another quiet advantage: food security. As climate change hits global agriculture, countries from the Middle East to East Asia are looking at Indonesia's fertile land, fisheries, and tropical crops. Indonesian agriculture, from seafood to palm oil to rice, is becoming a strategic asset in a world worried about shortages. And here's the final twist. The more Indonesia grows, the less it depends on foreign powers. But the more foreign powers depend on Indonesia. That's the real shift happening right now. Indonesia isn't rising alone. It's pulling the world with it. Indonesia's power isn't loud. It doesn't come from armies or nuclear weapons. It comes from geography, resources, people, and strategy. The invisible levers that keep the world running. From the choke points of the Malacca Strait to the minerals powering the green energy revolution, from a booming middle class to its neutral, non-aligned diplomacy, Indonesia has quietly become indispensable. And as it builds Nusantara, attracts foreign investment, and strengthens its industries, the balance of global dependence is shifting. The world may have thought it could shape Indonesia, but the truth is, Indonesia is shaping the world. Now, if you want to know why ruling Indonesia was nearly impossible, then you can watch this video showing up on your screen. Thanks for watching, mate, and a bundle of thanks for hitting the subscribe button. Bye.